In the dead of night, Ethan arrived at the crumbling Victorian mansion he had inherited from his uncle, a man he barely knew. As he stepped closer, the wooden door creaked open as if inviting him in. Shadows danced across the walls and a chill ran down his spine. The air was thick with dust and each step echoed through the empty halls. The air felt heavy with history and secrets, an oppressive silence filling the grand hallway. As he walked deeper, the faint sound of dripping water echoed in the distance, a reminder of the mansion's disrepair. He shook off the unease, reminding himself of the inheritance he had to claim. As he stepped inside, the floorboards groaned under his weight, adding to the eerie ambiance of the room. Heart racing, he pushed the door open, revealing a dimly lit study filled with ancient tomes and odd artifacts. Intrigued, Ethan approached the orb, feeling an inexplicable pull as he reached out to touch its surface. Images of shadowy figures and arcane rituals swirled in his mind, leaving him breathless and disoriented. His instincts screamed at him to flee, but a voice deep within urged him to stay and uncover the truth. He began examining the shelves, pulling down books that were bound in cracked leather and filled with unfamiliar symbols. As the hours passed, the atmosphere in the house grew heavier. Every sound seemed amplified: the groan of the wind, the creak of the old floorboards, the occasional dripping of water from some unseen source. And then the whispers started. At first, Ethan thought it was the wind playing tricks on his mind, but as the night wore on, the voices became clearer. They echoed down the hallways, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Faint, disembodied murmurs speaking in languages he couldn't understand. He tried to shake it off as his imagination, but the sound crawled under his skin. He felt eyes on him, though he was alone. Then came the scratching. His flashlight flickered and he cursed, slapping it until the light steadied. It started softly like the sound of fingernails against wood. Ethan froze his breath, catching in his throat. The noise was coming from upstairs, from the third floor, the forbidden room. With every rational part of his mind screaming at him to leave, Ethan found himself climbing the stairs. When he reached the third floor, the air was freezing. The whispers grew louder with each step, and the scratching became frantic, like something was desperately trying to claw its way out. His breath fogged in front of him as he stood before the door at the end of the hall. It looked like every other door in the house, old and cracked with age. But this one felt alive. The key burned in his pocket. Slowly, almost mechanically, he pulled it out and inserted it in. The door swung open with a creak that echoed through the house, revealing nothing but darkness. His flashlight flickered again and he stepped inside, his heart hammering in his chest. The room was small and empty except for a single wooden chair in the center. Strangely, the walls were covered in deep, jagged scratches as though something had been trying to escape. But that wasn't what made Ethan's stomach twist with dread. It was the smell. An overwhelming stench of rot and decay filled the room so thick it made him gag. He covered his mouth with his sleeve, his eyes watering. The whispers grew louder, filling his head until they were deafening. "Get out!" The voice seemed to echo, chilling him to the bone. The walls seemed to close in around him and the temperature dropped even further. Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind him. His pulse raced and he tried to calm himself. Ethan whirled around, his flashlight cutting through the dark, but the beam seemed weaker now, barely illuminating the room. It was just an old house, just his mind playing tricks. He had to get out. He had to. Scratching returned. But this time it wasn't coming from the walls. It was coming from beneath the floorboards. Ethan stumbled back, his flashlight flickering wildly. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and then he heard it, a low guttural moan. Something was under the floor, something alive, or worse, something that had once been. But something was wrong. Something was terribly wrong. He tried to stand, but his body wouldn't move. Panic surged through him as he realized he was no longer in control. He could feel his muscles, his bones, but they didn't respond to his commands. He was a prisoner in his own body. Slowly, methodically, his hands began to move. They reached into his pocket and pulled out the key. His fingers wrapped around it tightly, almost possessively, as he stood up from the chair and walked towards the door. The house was quiet as he descended the stairs. Dust motes floated in the sunlight streaming through the windows. He reached the front door, but he didn't leave. Everything was exactly as it had been when he arrived, except for one thing. Ethan wasn't Ethan anymore. Instead, he placed the key back on the dusty table near the entrance. Do not enter the room at the end of the hall on the third floor. His hands moved with purpose, his mind screaming in silent terror as he took out a piece of paper and began to write. No matter what you hear, no matter what you feel. As he placed the note beside the key, Ethan felt a presence behind him. Leave it locked. You must understand. It is for your own good. He didn't need to turn around to know what it was. It was waiting for the next one. He could feel it. its twisted. When Ethan awoke, the room was silent, enveloping him in an eerie stillness that felt almost suffocating. The floor was intact, the air was still, and the stench of decay was gone, leaving behind only a sense of unsettling calm. He was sitting in the wooden chair, his hands resting calmly in his lap, a stark contrast to the chaos that had enveloped him before. Outside, the world seemed to move on, oblivious to the turmoil he had endured. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to gather his thoughts and piece together the fragments of memory that eluded him. The whispers were gone, but he could still feel them lurking at the edges of his mind, like shadows that refused to dissipate. The door to the room was open, and beyond it the hallway was bathed in soft morning light, inviting yet foreboding at the same time. It was over. The night was over, but the remnants of fear still clung to his skin like a second layer.